this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Welcome to the World War II podcast. Today I'm speaking with Erik Kreps about a remarkable family mystery. His grandfather, Colonel Kenneth Ray Kreps, served in the Second World War, and after returning home, he sealed his belongings in a chest with instruction that it should not be opened till after his death. For decades, it remained closed, and no one in the family knew what was inside. After Colonel Kreps died, the chest went into storage and was almost forgotten. At one point, it was nearly auctioned off, which could have meant the contents were lost forever. Instead, it was saved, and when it was finally opened, it revealed a life and a wartime experience that Erik had never fully known. Erik, thanks for joining me. Before we get to what was inside the chest, I wonder, growing up, how much did you know about your grandfather, his war service, and where he's from?
I knew very little. So in my realm of understanding at that point, I just kind of knew him in a grandfatherly way. He was living in California with my grandmother. I had other family out there. And so we would visit in the summers, and that would be kind of my time with them. And I really didn't have any clue. My dad had mentioned to my brother and I a couple times growing up this one-time conversation that he had with his dad when he was younger. But then as I got older, I got more interested in family history and more interested in learning more about my grandfather's secret past. My dad kind of wanted to follow in his footsteps. And so when my dad was 16 and in high school, he joined his ROTC. And so on his 16th birthday, after he signed up, then my grandfather sat him down. And I think that he didn't want to dissuade him from this path, but he wanted him to know what it might cost. And he said, listen close, son, I'm only going to speak of this once and never again. And so they sat down in the study and he started telling him about his experiences in the war. He started to break down, he started to get emotional about it. And so they didn't get too terribly far. And then at some point, my dad comforted him and said, we can finish later. But it turned out that was the one time that he talked about it and it never came up again. He learned an awful lot in that conversation. One of the things he also learned was that my grandfather had this war chest, and he said the war chest is not to be opened until I die. My grandfather lived into his 90s, and so that's how the war chest was largely forgotten about. And then the last sort of piece of the mystery is, and I didn't know about this until later, but there was a 1973 fire at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, which housed millions of military documents, and my grandfather's personnel file was there, and it was among the 18 million files or so that were destroyed. When he passed away in 2002, I asked my dad about it. I knew that while the secret passed, that this might be the only place that we could ever learn of these things. And it became clear that it was much more personal for my dad because he was directly impacted by my grandfather's experiences in the war, and I could tell it's very emotional for him. My dad did go on a similar path. Thankfully, there was not another world war for him to fight in after World War II, but he had a military career himself. And so I would bring it up from time to time. I started doing some research at the graduate library here at the University of Michigan. And if I learned any little thing that I thought might overlap my grandfather's story from what little I knew, then I would share it with my dad. Then my family started to grow and kind of life moved on and time passed. And then the chest was kind of forgotten about. So when it came up again, sadly, my dad several years ago was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So my wife and I went out to visit him and my stepmom. My dad was in an assisted living facility, and it was clear that he wouldn't be inclined anymore to examine the contents of the war chest. So I asked my stepmom about it. She said it's gone. This is when I found out about the family storage unit. Evidently, the background was when my grandfather passed away, and then a few years later, my grandmother couldn't live alone anymore. So she went to live with my dad and stepmom. They were taking care of her, and then they were going to sell my grandparents' home. They hired a moving company called Starving Students. I think it might still be around. But the Starving Students went in, and they pretty much just boxed up everything that was in the house, and including like things that you'd never need in a family storage unit, like cleaning supplies and stuff like this. They just threw it all in boxes, threw it all into this storage unit in Riverside, California, and there it sat for 20 years or so. When my wife and I were visiting my dad and stepmom, she was under an enormous amount of stress because my dad was now in assisted living. Her mother was in the same assisted living facility, and she had to cut costs. And so she just, stopped making payments on the storage unit, and she said it had defaulted and was put up for auction. I didn't realize until that moment how much it meant to me to try to resolve this mystery, this great mystery of my grandfather's past. And so after a sleepless night, my wife knew I was troubled. She talked to my stepmom. They called the storage facility and learned that the auction was actually not scheduled till the following month. And so to defer default, we just had to pay off the balance, and then we could access the contents again. So this we did very eagerly, and we had one day to spare before our flight back to Michigan. So then this is when my wife Sandy and I, we spent all day in that California heat, just going through everything in there.
You literally just open the door and there's just masses of stuff piled up there, and you're thinking, okay, where do I start? And I think the treasure chest is in here somewhere, and it's probably at the most, the worst place at the back. I've got to get everything out first.
Exactly. And so we were tearing through these boxes. My grandmother also was an artist, and so she had all this heavy ceramic equipment that was in there. And I really would have loved to have kept so many of those memories, but I really was zeroing in on trying to find the war chest. To our amazement, we did find the war chest, and then we found all sorts of other things surrounding it and in the storage unit, like my grandmother had saved every letter that my grandfather had ever sent to her when he was away, including the letters from war, all sorts of old newspapers from that era, binders of flight logs of my grandfather's, military documents. A lot of that was in the war chest. He had lots of materials from the Air War College that he later taught at. And so we just grabbed everything that we could, got it into the rental vehicle, and then shortly thereafter, we had to head to the hotel by the airport. One of the last boxes that we had taken out of there was a wooden box that was in the war chest, and it was nailed shut. So we pried that open, and inside we discovered his M1911 handgun and a Japanese dagger. The gun had a tag with his name on it, but the dagger, there was no notes or anything about it. I believe it was probably a grim memento that he had kept from his wartime experiences. The hotel by the airport, we realized that we needed more luggage, so we stopped by a Walmart, near midnight, bought some luggage. We get to the hotel. They're having technical difficulties, but they get us to our room. We're packing and unpacking. We got everything spread all over the place. We're taking the contents and running down the hall to the weight room in the hotel and using the pullers and the pulleys and levers to try to weigh our luggage because we know it's going to cost a fortune. Then at some point when all this is happening, running back and forth, a stranger walks into our hotel room and sees, everything spread all over the place, including the weaponry. And then she just says, "I'm so sorry, this is the room they gave me." And it turned out because of the technical difficulties, they had given us both the same room. Thankfully, she went back and got that squared away. But it was a very surreal situation. At some point, we realized that the most important stuff to me was the documents. We had tons of artifacts, but I wanted to read what the documents said. We also realized that, hey, they don't weigh the carry-ons. So we put the weaponry, the artifacts, the stuff we might lose. It occurred to us, you can't just walk onto a plane with a gun these days. I don't know if you ever. The weaponry was packed with all the clothing because we figured we could replace the clothing, artifacts in another suitcase, and then all of the documents and other heavy things in our carry-on. So we were very weighed down, but that's where all of the weight was. Get to the airport, we realized a duct tape box is not a sufficient carrying case for firearms. And so we went to declare the firearms. We explained the situation to the attendant there, and she said, okay, I'll send it through. But she said, leave your phones on because you're likely to get called by security. We kept our phones on every time we saw a security member. We thought, oh, this is it. We're going to be arrested. Or somehow we made it through, got to the airport. We didn't in Detroit. We didn't know if our luggage would make it with us, but it was there. We didn't dare open it on the spot. We got back by shuttle to our car. We opened it, and everything was there. Everything had made it. And we started jumping up and down and calling each other Bonnie and Clyde because this weaponry had made it across the states with us. But then that's where the real adventure began, is when we were able to get it home and actually start going through the contents and digesting what we were learning.
And it's just an incredible treasure trove of, how you describe it, stuff. Just it's like he's finished his military service already, really, rather than the war, and it's all being kept. Incredible, all those letters as well. I was going to start with the medals because they're perhaps a point to the service that he had. He has 18 separate awards,
14 medals, or it might be 13 medals, and then a ribbon, an additional ribbon, and then 18 total awards. But it included the Silver Star, Purple Heart, Distinguished Flying Cross. There was also 5 Bronze Stars and 10 Oak Leaf Clusters. You received the Presidential Unit Citation 4 times, also a Philippine President citation. Learning all of those decorations that he'd received just blew our minds. But then, as we were reading through the documents, just seeing the people that he came across, that he had interactions with Eisenhower and with Churchill and with Patton and with George C. Marshall, Curtis LeMay, and then other leaders of that time that might not be as well known these days. A friend of mine who learned about it later said it was almost like he was a real life Forrest Gump, that he was just, although I think of him as much more dignified than Forrest Gump, but it was a similar type of journey. Somehow he was coming across all of these huge moments in history and all of these massively important leaders in that era and really in world history. So it's just been an incredible journey of discovery.
But it's not just the world. I mean, he is there at the start. I was going to say he's there at the start. He's there at Clark Field, on that day of infamy. But actually, I wonder if we just skip before that. How much you know about him, or have you managed to piece together of how he found himself in the Air Force during the war? What was his background?
So he was born in 1910 in Los Angeles. His dad was Officer Walter Kreps of the LAPD. His dad has the unenvious distinction of being the first motorcycle officer killed in the line of duty for the LAPD. He was on the speed squad. He died when my grandfather was 6 years old. Then his mother was raising him for the next 4 years, and she, I think, was the big influence in his life. Later, she said, I began endeavoring to teach him to reason and recognize results. As he grew older, I became more insistent that he make his own decisions about using certain fundamentals that are the same in all time and places. And then she also wrote that she used to be in ox carts and stagecoaches, and she found it fitting that he was flying the skies. She was a huge influence. 4 years after her husband died, she remarried a man named Amos Williams, who was part of the LA Fire Department. Amos Williams and my grandfather, by all accounts, they got along wonderfully. And in fact, Amos Williams, many years later, would write that he doesn't recall that there was ever a crossword between them. And so he grew up, from being born in 1910, he grew up with the backdrop of, like everybody in the world at that time, there was World War I, the flu pandemic. His college years were about the time of the Great Depression. In fact, before going off to college, he went to Alaska to mine for gold. Apparently decided that wasn't a good future, so he came back and enrolled at UCLA. In UCLA, he had a degree in philosophy. He joined the ROTC, and then when he graduated in 1933, he signed up with the U.S. Army Air Forces, and he was recommended for an appointment as a flying cadet. And so that's when he got assigned to the 19th Bombardment Group. His lieutenant colonel who trained him said he considered him one of the best large airplane pilots in the service. So he apparently had found a career that was good for him and that he was skilled at. He had been courting my grandmother for the 1930s as well. And they ended up getting married in 1937 in Hawaii. While there, he was doing military training. He got a certificate for a gas officer's course in chemical warfare school. He was doing lots of training that would end up serving him later in the war, that I'm sure he didn't realize how that would come to pass. But after their marriage, they moved back to California. He worked as kind of a public relations officer, and he would share press releases on military preparation. And they knew that war was potentially building and that the U.S. might get dragged into the war at some point. And Like he would speak on different topics. Like one of the things he spoke about was military use of public airfields and potential defenses if like the East Coast was attacked. And so those things continued. There was a gentleman from the Griffith Observatory in Los Angeles who contacted me. He'd been researching the observatory's role in the era between World War II and the Apollo missions. He had discovered that there was a top secret mission in May of 1941 that my grandfather was involved with. My grandfather was a pilot in the lead plane, and at the time it was the largest mass flight of B-17s in the world that had ever flown, and the mission was to move them from California to Hawaii. Where the Griffith Observatory came into play is his group, the 19th Bombardment Group. They went there and they were shown the mission in the planetarium. They were going to be flying overnight using celestial navigation. And so they used the planetarium to study the stars and study their route. The mission was a success. The bombers were there at Hickam Field in Hawaii. And then several months later, he completed a similar mission to the Philippines. And so that's where he was at Clark Field. Clark Field now had some bomber planes as well. And then that's where he was when war started for the U.S. He was there on December 7th.
He's wounded at Clarkfield, isn't he? I don't know if he's on that first day, but did he get a Purple Heart at Clarkfield?
Yes. His introduction to the war, and it was interesting reading because right up until that point, he was writing letters to my grandmother. In fact, there was one letter that was postmarked in the Philippines in November, and then in Honolulu on December 4th, and then Los Angeles, December 7th. And then the letters abruptly stopped. But we found out what happened from a number of sources. One is my dad's recollection that he shared with my brother and I, and he also wrote a letter about it after my grandfather died. And then also there was, from his awards, like his Purple Heart, we could piece together what happened. And he later earned a Silver Star while he was still in the Philippines. And there was a diary of a Lieutenant Fairfield, who was also stationed at Clark Field when it was attacked. My grandfather's introduction, apparently he was in the barracks. He was on the bottom bunk. His best friend was on the top bunk. Bullets ripped through the barracks. His best friend was hit and died in his arms. The rest of Clark Field is getting decimated. There's the bombing and strafing coming in. Apparently he makes it out of the barracks. It is in a trench by the airfield. Bombs and bullets are flying. This Lieutenant Fairfield ends up trying to get to a plane and he gets hit with bullets. His legs are useless out in the middle of the runway. So my grandfather and two of his fellow airmen run out and they grab Fairfield. They drag him to the trench and save him. Apparently my grandfather's waving his handgun around trying to shoot the planes down. After the attack is done, he's injured somehow. He doesn't ever fully divulge the specific injuries. He assists the other wounded, the medical officer, in attending to the other wounded. After that's done, it's a bit chaotic. He decides to lead fellow airmen that want to join him into the surrounding woods. In the woods, as luck or providence would have it, he and his fellow airmen are taken in by Philippine guerrillas. And this group quickly trains them in hand-to-hand combat. So he's an airman who's supposed to be flying above the clouds, his role in war dropping bombs. And here he is down there in the darkness, in the mud, in the jungles. Their method of warfare is stealth raids on Japanese camps, on the perimeter of Japanese camps at night. And so they don't want to fire their guns. They don't want to give away their positions. And my grandfather, his weapon is a garrote made of a piano wire between bamboo handles. And I think that this is probably one of the things that haunted him as part of, one of the many reasons perhaps that he never would talk about his military past. According to my dad from the conversation, my grandfather ended up killing dozens of men in this period. And he said that he saw the faces of the men he killed, and they were mostly young and green to war. So this was brutal. It was kind of as close up as combat gets. A few weeks later, after the start of the war, his wife receives a telegram from Manila. So he's made his way to Manila. He did keep a location diary that we found. And
this is fascinating, that in itself.
Yeah. And so it was from the end of December through the beginning of May, I believe, when he finally makes his way to Australia. And there's 17 sites identified. So he's on the move all over the Philippines. At one point, he is in Mariveles on a ship or a boat of some sort that they're getting out to the sea, and then they're under attack by several Japanese planes. And so they have to abandon that mission. I don't know if that was one where they were going to try to get to Australia or what the purpose of that particular activity was. But he earns a Silver Star. They said he explained the highest levels of gallantry of the service in protecting his fellow soldiers, keeping order, evacuating them, saving lives. And so eventually he survives this era of the war. Actually, during this period were probably the two most moving things to me from all of the discoveries. One is a letter he writes to his daughter on her first birthday. And so this is when he's in the jungles of the Philippines somewhere. His survival is very much in doubt. And he writes, "When you receive this, if ever." And he just poignantly, he expresses his love for her. His philosophical background kind of comes through, and he's sort of portraying what the world circumstance is in. He asks forgiveness that his generation was not able to make a better world for her. And then a year later, one of his friends, when he's back home again, he has a brief respite from the war. His friend has dinner with him and his wife. They share the letter. His wife shares the letter with the friend, and then the friend writes a follow-up to his daughter on her second birthday and saying, I want to explain some things that your dad couldn't or wouldn't say, but it's important that you know. And then he expresses things that really so powerfully depict, I think, that what made the greatest generation what it was, and that the war was starting to turn at that point. But it was certainly very much not, the outcome was not determined. And I love that letter so much. One of the things I'd like to do is to see if I can find any surviving relatives. I don't think he had any direct relatives that I've been able to find. His name was Phil Stitt that wrote this letter. But it's powerful, and I want anybody in his family that's close to him, I would love to be able to share this with them if possible. But in any event, my grandfather eventually makes it to Australia. From the relative safety there, he writes letters home again.
It must be odd because he must have suddenly popped up out of nowhere. There must have been almost nothing. Then I guess he gets to Australia, February, March, wherever it is. And then suddenly letters start arriving. So his family must have had nothing of what on earth's going on. We know about the fall of the Philippines. What's happened to him?
Yeah, and I wish that there was somehow a way that I could have read my grandmother's letters to him, but he had no way to save any of those when he's off at war. But I can't imagine just, the fear and worry. And then from his letters to her, it's very clear that he wants to shield her from worry. And he even talks about that you have enough going on that it's best that you don't know what this war is like. Every so often, he would pull back the veil a little bit. In one of her letters, evidently, she said that she wanted him to pray to be sent home. And he says, I can't pray to be sent home because you can't defeat the enemy with that type of philosophy. You've got to be, he said, I do hope to go home someday, but to win this war, we've got to be just as ruthless, just as vicious, and more.
That sort of fits with those two letters. If you think about those two letters to his daughter, they're both written early enough into the war for them to have seen war and think, we might not be coming back. We're going to have to fight this out. So this is what I'm trying to leave you, a breadcrumb of who I am kind of thing. Because we have no end in sight. We're here for the duration kind of thing.
He writes, he says, what I experienced was a drop in the bucket compared to what some of the boys have been through. And compared to what's ahead, that was a storm in a teacup. I never dwell on what happened since Clark Field except for one thing. I shall never forget those we left behind. As long as I live, I'll not forget. None of us who are left will forget. The Navy has her Pearl Harbor. We have our PI in Java, and our eyes are constantly turned toward the rising sun. There will be retribution. He also writes, this is no panty-waist war. This is a war where to beat Japan and the Nazi machine, we must shed our blood, break our hearts, and strive 24 hours each day to achieve the means to beat the enemy. There can be no more strategic withdrawals because there's no place left to withdraw to. Our backs to the wall, those of us on far-flung fronts, and we are giving our lives to keep you who are at home from even guessing what this war is like. I can only imagine what she must have thought reading those things. He also kept a lengthy roster of officers and non-officers, a separate roster that were participating in the Philippine and Java campaigns. And the sad part is there's so many of the names he's written in, KIA or MIA. So his fellow warriors were very much on his heart and mind, and the ones that never could come back. And he fortunately was one that was able to come back eventually.
Well, his wife must have been relieved when his next posting is the personal pilot to Henry Stimson, the Secretary of State for War.
Yes.
Which is a remarkable posting. You would have thought it might have gone to someone who had been already in the States rather than someone who'd been at the front. And you'd thought, well, how did they choose him?
He gets back from his time in Australia, and this is where he's given a brief respite. And there's newspaper articles that talk about him coming back, and that MacArthur had given him an award for gallantry. And then he's welcomed home by his mother, and they have a party with 175 guests. This part blew my mind, where evidently he had friends in Hollywood. He had a best friend whose name was Jimmy Ellison, who I don't think anybody is aware of today, but apparently was a Hollywood actor back then. But one of the articles said that he and his wife were entertained at Romanoff's in Hollywood by their friends, the Gary Coopers. And so he was friends with Gary Cooper, and I don't think there was a bigger star in the world at that time than Cooper. He was among the top ones. And then at that time, they received a telegram from Brigadier General Eugene Eubank. He was the officer in the lead of that top secret mission from the Griffith Observatory. And so that might have been why he had my grandfather in mind. And he said, I have an assignment to talk about that's important to us both. And that turned out to be as the pilot for Stimson. And so it was really through Stimson. So he had that brutal, bloody portion of war under his belt in the Philippines and in the Pacific theater. He becomes Stimson's pilot, and then that introduces him to kind of the aristocratic part of war and all of those important things that Stimson did. I think Stimson might be even underappreciated as a historical figure. Everywhere he went in the world or in the States, it was my grandfather from 1943 through the end of the war that was transporting him. So he was right there with him for all of those important decisions and conferences and things that Stimson was a part of.
And I imagine Stimson is in almost perpetual motion as he flies around chatting to everybody, which is quite remarkable. So the interesting thing about this part of his war is this is where he seems to have picked up all kinds of bits and pieces that are just so exciting in the chest. I mean, shall we start with what is one of the most remarkable one? Churchill's cigar.
Towards the close of the war, so I believe it might have been after VE Day, Stimson is meeting with Churchill. My grandfather's in the room. Churchill is passing around cigars. He hands one to my grandfather. Colonel Kreps sticks it in his pocket. And Churchill pauses and says, well, aren't you going to smoke it? Kreps says, well, I'd like to give it to my father. He was referring to his stepfather, actually. And Churchill says, in that case, you can smoke this one then. And he hands him another. And I'm imagining at that point, anybody else who was in the room is probably mad that they didn't do the same thing, because now they just smoked the cigar that Churchill gave him. And my grandfather got to do that and keep one of them. He ends up bringing that cigar back to the States, gives it to his stepfather. And his stepfather is so moved by that he carved an ivory monogram cigar case, and he gifts it back to my grandfather. And so that actually is still in the family. We still have that very valuable to us memento. But then also, while he is over there as a result of traveling with Stimson, that's when he has the opportunity to have dinner with Eisenhower, one of the trips in Europe. And he writes that he sat next to Eisenhower, and he's as fine a dinner companion as he is a commander. Later in that trip, he meets Patton in Normandy, and he says, the general gave me a jeep and a guide plus an MP and turned me loose. Evidently, he even almost met the Pope, but he said the Pope must have been busy because he didn't come out to meet us when we were walking around his grounds. Just an incredible trip, and many others like it. In fact, one of the things I would like to do is study more Stimson's journey, because from that 1943-1945 period, I know that my grandfather was right there with him. In fact, he and Stimson grew quite close. Stimson, when presenting Colonel Kreps with the Legion of Merit Award, said of him that Colonel Kreps made a material contribution to the nation's war effort. In fact, towards the close of the war, Stimson in his diaries refers to the Manhattan Project as S1, and I don't know what S1 stands for exactly, but it's very surreal reading through some of those diary entries and the weight of the world on Stimson's shoulders and other leaders as he's writing about S1, in real time, because he doesn't know the outcome, he doesn't know what's going to come of the Manhattan Project. And then, referencing my grandfather, an entry the same day or in the surrounding days. In fact, one of the things I learned from Stimson's diary is that they received a report from Groves, who was one of the leaders of the Manhattan Project, about the success of the testing. And they said it had far more destructive power than they had anticipated. Well, Stimson learns this, Truman learns this, and apparently Truman is giddy. And Stimson in his diary records that when he met with Churchill said, I was trying to figure out why Truman was suddenly so confident. And we were meeting with Stalin and he was dictating things. And he said, well, now I know the results of the test. I know why he was so excited. And I agree with him. This is all happening. And my grandfather's on the periphery of this, but with Stimson. Meanwhile, my grandmother's pregnant with my dad. So my dad's due to be born. Stimson actually altered his schedule so that my grandfather could be with his wife for the birth of their son. He was going to name his son a junior. He was going to be Kenneth Ray Kreps Jr., but in Stimson's honor, he changed his middle name to Henry. And so my father was born August 4th, 2 days before the Hiroshima bomb.
It wasn't for his birth that Marshall writes the humorous letter to your grandmother, is it?
I believe that was some years later. So after the war, my grandfather worked for George C. Marshall. A couple of years before Marshall wins the Nobel Peace Prize, my grandparents had 3 children. My aunt was the oldest one, the one that my grandfather wrote the letter to from the Philippines. My dad was born next, and then he had a younger brother that was born. And this was about the birth of that younger brother. And Marshall writes a humorous letter written to my grandmother saying, Colonel Kreps, I'm going to grant him the week off or whatever additional time he needs to be with you. But please be sure he knows this is in no means an endorsement for the extracurricular activities that have led to this condition. So I thought that was great that he developed a relationship with Marshall, also with Stimson, that they were very close. They could exchange humor together. Stimson's health had started to go down shortly after the war, maybe even during the war. And my grandfather would help arrange trips for Stimson and his wife to go to the Adirondacks, I think was a place they liked to vacation. And so they very much stayed in touch after the war as well. Shortly after the war, one of the things too, in terms of my grandfather having significant moments with history, it was time for the military spending to be drawn down. And so Truman wanted to cut the military budget significantly, which makes sense. We're not in World War anymore. But evidently, none of the military leaders wanted to be the ones to authorize this. And so the way my dad puts it, he says that DOD bosses were strangely absent. And so Colonel Kreps was left to sign this document that was very unpopular in the military because it was massively cutting the funding. And then my grandfather was evidently informed after that he would always have a place in the military, but that this doomed his promotability to general. And so that's why he ended up as evidently the term is full bird colonel, I've learned recently, but that he was 20 years in grade. So he remained as colonel. He still continued to serve. And so after the war, he became an air attaché in Ireland. There's newspaper articles from Ireland saying he was one of the most popular attachés they've had in this country. There's all sorts of accolades coming in on what he did. There was the director of intelligence. He wrote about my grandfather having gone on an intelligence mission of arduous duty and that the results were gratifying. So that's another thing I would love to learn is, well, what was this intelligence mission? What was their aim? There was a naval admiral that wrote high praise of my grandfather and his work in Ireland, and that he was making friends and growing close with the leaders of the Irish government and all sorts of officials. And I think that they were working together. I don't think that it was an intelligence mission against Ireland. I think that they were coordinated in whatever this mission was, but that's still a mystery to me. But he received high praise. After his time in Ireland, he came back to the States. I think that might have been when he worked for George Marshall, and then at some point he becomes an instructor at the Air War College. He had worked with Curtis LeMay earlier in the war. He wasn't part of the bombing strategy that LeMay had carried out on Japan towards the end of the war. We found a letter from LeMay some point after that, wishing my grandfather well. While he was at the Air War College, he ends up getting consulted by Congress. Senator Barry Goldwater had reached out to him. They were studying the future of air power. And he wrote on behalf of the Air War College, and it's a really interesting letter where he gives a little bit of history and he talks about, land power and sea power. He ultimately concludes that he thinks that the U.S. emphasis should be on air power because it can be brought to bear before any of the other two types of armed forces can unfold. And he says that the U.S. should be the preeminent air power in the world. And I think that was what Congress and military leaders must have agreed, and that's what they strived for. He ends up closing out his career as an executive at Lackland Air Force Base, as the executive officer there. He begins to have health struggles and have something in the medical documents that they describe as chronic brain syndrome that I think would probably be called PTSD these days. So he makes the decision to retire. The day he retires, it turns out to be it's the same day that Kennedy is assassinated. November 22nd, 1963, he retired. And my dad says that, after this, the local radio station comes on. They're playing Ave Maria, announced the president has died. And then he said that his dad, just went into the 1,000-yard stare. Like, this is how it ends. This is how his service ends, with the president being assassinated. And my dad said that the next morning that my grandfather he must have been having a flashback. He wasn't in his right mind. They were on a military base and they had to call emergency. They said they brought his dad away. He came back later, probably heavily drugged, but in his right mind. And then they moved on for life after his military service. That was the close of it. So it closed very sadly after his 30 years of service. So he went out with very little fanfare because the country had many more things on its mind at that point.
Right, we're going to pause there. Folks, we'll be back in a moment. What a remarkable job of piecing all that together from that. I could just see so many rabbit holes to have to go down looking at that. I've been intrigued to know what chronic brain syndrome is and how that maps across to modern thinking on, because I know every time they come up with names for shell shock or PTSD, they're all slightly different, meaning different things. It'd be intriguing to know what in 1963 what that actually meant. Where's the chest now? I mean, have you got it all bubble wrapped and hermetically sealed?
We emptied the contents of the chest to get everything back on the flight. The chest itself is at my dad and stepmom's place in California. And in fact, not long after that, she wrote that I discovered another war chest in the garage. We've since visited, and that also was another one of my grandfather's. It happened to have some of his old uniforms in it, so that was also very neat. It didn't have documents and secrets, but it had stuff that is very valuable to us to hang on to. And so my stepmom is hanging on to all of those things for us in California. Another thing that happened is a Michigan periodical wrote an article on my grandfather. I got contacted by a gentleman living in California, and he said that several years ago, he came across what he termed, he was at a swap meet, and he came across Colonel Kreps' whole life laid out on the ground. He thought this was so sad that this veteran's life was just out there for sale, and he said there was college books, there was all sorts of photos. He said he bought some of those things, and then he wanted to try to find, are there any family members for this? He couldn't find anybody at that time until he saw this article. And that's when he reached out to me and he said he had photos of the pictures he had saved, but he said that he had donated those and he told me where he had donated them. And I was trying to figure out, as my stepmama, where could these materials have come from? And she didn't know. But what I think it is, so there's maybe more to be discovered from my grandfather's materials out there somewhere. So I mentioned he had 3 children. Well, after he passed away, it's possible that my aunt and my uncle might have taken some things that were meaningful to them. And so maybe those things didn't make it into the storage unit. And I'm guessing that that's probably what that was. I don't know if it would have been from my aunt or my uncle. They both have passed away. And so it could be that some of their stuff was collected and put up at a swap meet. But I do hope to find out more specifics of those materials someday and continue to learn as we go. There's really endless amounts of information that I could learn just based on what we already know about his journeys and perhaps some others yet to be discovered.
If you could get the record of where Stimson was, you'd be able to put dates to all these places really accurately, because those dates must exist where Stimson is, and that fleshes it out. And from there, you know specifically where to look in archives of specific dates. Now, I'm only interested in these dates of pictures of Stimson or news articles or whatever.
And from that, I might be able just to perhaps find some additional documentation where my grandfather might be listed or noted. Yale kindly had sent me the copies of Stimson's diaries from the time period that my grandfather served as his pilot. I went through them, but looking mainly for references to my grandfather, which, there were dozens of them. But I want to go back through that period of time, and because Stimson was very detailed in what he recorded, and I might be able to trace Stimson's whereabouts as well. And I know that among my grandfather's medals, he had a number of campaign medals that were all across the world, like Asiatic Pacific campaign. Let's see, what were some of these campaign medals? I had written them down. Yeah, he had the American Campaign Medal, Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal, European, African, Middle East Campaign, World War II Victory Medal, National Defense Service Medal, Philippine Defense Ribbon, American Defense Service Medal. Basically everywhere that Stimson went for that 3-year time period, my grandfather would have been there with him. And so there's a lot more to learn.
I assume to get the campaign medals, you have to clock up X amount of days in that theatre. So he's probably visited everywhere for actually quite an extensive period of time with Stimson, with the Stimson's meetings and things. So he has literally been across the globe. There probably isn't that many servicemen who have been to that many theatres with that many campaign medals.
Yeah, in fact, as part of my learning journey, I've utilized AI a little bit. Like, for instance, on my grandfather's DD-214, it's kind of written in shorthand. So I would feed it into AI and say, can you interpret this for me? And one of the conclusions was that combination, especially the Silver Star plus Distinguished Flying Cross, Purple Heart, and 4 presidential unit citations on a 30-year Air Force colonel, is extraordinarily rare and places him in the top fraction of 1% of all World War II to Cold War U.S. Air Force officers for combat and service decorations. I knew that the discoveries would be extremely important to me as his relative. And then just as we would learn, as I would pull these references out in these documents, I would go running out to my wife and saying, look at this, look what it says. Look who this, you see this name? As it unfolded, I realized that, there's other people, that history buffs that might be interested in some of these things as well. And so I've been happy and eager to share with anybody who might have interest. And so at one point we were asked to present the findings at as a World War II memorial event. And so that's what initiated the slideshow. And then I've shared that with others, and people that know a little bit about that era are usually just kind of blown away at just those intersections that he had. And then the backdrop of the world events that were going on that even indirectly were part of his life, like the flu pandemic, even World War I way back when, like we talked about. And kind of maybe a bitter irony for my grandfather, my birth date happens to be December 7th as well, many, many years later. I remember my grandmother saying she so wished that I had been born on December 8th, which was evidently All Saints' Day or something in Catholicism, but yet I was born as this never-ending reminder of the past.
Day of infamy.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the day you arrived.
Yep. That's what I grew up, my understanding.
Well, Erik, thank you for sharing your story and taking us through the journey of uncovering the chest and its contents. It's been fascinating to hear how something locked away for so long transformed your understanding of your grandfather and the legacy he left behind.
Not at all, absolutely.
Folks, you can find Erik on X, formerly Twitter, at Veiled Valor, where he posts updates on discoveries along with occasional links to others connected to the story. I'll put a link in the show notes. There is also a link there to a set of slides with the photographs of the chests and the contents and more on Colonel Kreps for anyone who would like to explore further. Now, don't forget, if you have enjoyed the show, you can find me on Patreon. Patrons get access to advert-free episodes, extended episodes, and bonus material that never made it into the main show. So to sign up, go to patreon.com/WW2podcast. Well, that is all for this episode. I'm Angus Wallace. and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.